Moses is one of the most interesting characters in the Bible. I hope to show you why. So we all know that Moses was the prophet that brought down the law to the Jewish people, and he has become the symbol for law pretty much around the world. So in talking about Moses, you think about law. But there's a lot more to Moses that you need to know about. Moses was a prophet in the Jewish system of things. He was one of the oldest names in the Bible, one of the most revered figures in the Bible, because he was supposedly so close to God. And he has given to the world the 10 Commandments. The history of Moses takes us back to ancient Egypt and to the Israelites back in the time of Egypt and ancient Egypt. He was a very fierce man for the truth and for leading the people, and supposedly the Jewish people, the Hebrew people. He was a major leader at the time when they were in Egypt. And he became, because he went up into the mountain and got the 10 Commandments from God, he became known as the lawgiver. The point we need to remember is that Moses was a very important man to the Hebrew people and into the history of the Jewish people in Egypt. He was supposedly born in Egypt and was bred in the house of the princess, and he was around royalty continually, and yet he had a love for the Jewish God, and so he protected the Jewish people, and he became so important to the history of the Hebrew people at the time of Egypt that today he even is recognized as a very important person to remember in history about law. He was the one who led them out of Egypt, according to the story that Egyptian life had become so difficult for the Jewish people, and they wanted out of Egypt. And so Moses was the one who had the strength to stand up before Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go, and we will leave out of Egypt." And so this is even today still remembered, a very heroic deed for Moses to step up and take the leadership of the Hebrew people and walk out of Egypt and leave Egypt. He took them up into the north, where we today refer to it as Lebanon and Israel, etc. The most important point I wish to make is the fact that there is so much more to this ancient prophet, leader of the Hebrew people, than has been discussed publicly, and I want to talk about some of those things. Moses was called by God to come up into the mountain of Mount Sinai, and God was going to give Moses what we now refer to as the 10 Commandments, which is actually a new dispensation for Jewish law, a brand new way to understand the Jewish understanding of God. And so he goes up into the mountain and he encounters the presence of God, and God gives him 10 commandments to bring back to the people to begin a new dispensation, a new understanding of God. And so when Moses comes down from the mountain, he sees the Jewish people still worshiping God the old way. They were worshiping a golden calf because it had to do with the particular astrological times in which they were living. And the times in which they were living then, at the time of the 10 Commandments, was Taurus to Bull. And so they were worshiping the golden calf in relation to Taurus to Bull. Well, Moses comes down and sees the Jewish people still worshiping in the old way, and becomes very frustrated. Before he even talks to them, he becomes very frustrated, and then throws the law. It was referred to as the law. And so Moses throws down the law and breaks the law. So Moses was the first lawbreaker. He was carrying 2 stones on which the laws, the 10 Commandments, were written. And so he carries these down, and then when he sees the Jewish people still worshiping the old way, he throws those down in frustration. And so that's where we get the term today, breaking the law. The Jews were worshiping the calf because they realized that they were worshiping the sun in the astrological age of Taurus the Bull. The next astrological age of which Moses was going to lead his people into the next age was going to be Aries the ram. And he was teaching them that there was a new way they were going to worship God. And this time they would blow the ram's horn to signify the age of the ram, the shofar. Here we have pictures showing that God is handing Moses the Ten Commandments on these tablets. The tablets themselves are very interesting, the design and what they were all about. We find that there's a very interesting connection between the 10 Commandments of the Hebrews and the 12 negative confessions of the Egyptians. The Egyptians already had 12 laws, so to speak, and they were called the 12 negative confessions. And so when you read the negative confessions and then the 10 Commandments, they're exactly the same. The only difference is one is in Egypt, they said, here are the things we will not do, as a negative confession. Here are the things we will not do. We will not lie, we will not steal, we will not do this or that. Well, the 10 Commandments says, the Lord says, you should not do this, you should not do that. But it's very similar. So we know basically where the 10 Commandments came from the 12 negative confessions of Egypt. Well, if you remember that religion itself is a development of human creativity, and so many stories in different religious books around the world, so many wonderful stories in theological ideas and concepts which obviously were just made up by men to promote their particular religious belief. But back to the Moses giving of the law, that particular scene of Moses with the 10 Commandments, the very stalls and the very stones themselves is very important. Moses is always the lawgiver, and the Jews today still respect Moses as probably one of the most important people in their history besides Abraham. You will see Moses in pictures and paintings and sculptures. Moses has horns. And it's been all around the world. People have wondered, why is it Moses, he has horns? And it's interesting to understand what the horns represent on Moses. The horns of Moses, and you will see that there was in the ancient world, at Moses' time, in that ancient time, there was a moon god, and the moon god's name was Sin, and he was always represented by the lower quarter of the moon. And so the lower quarter of the moon was used as a symbol for moon worship. And they had goddesses of moon worship, which you have. Also, in Rome, you had moon gods. The Native Americans also have horns because they counted their days by many moons. Their days were like the Hebrews today. After 6 o'clock began a new day. Well, the same thing with the Native Americans. So all of these people from the ancient Hebrews to the Native Americans were using a lunar calendar. Lunar simply meaning the moon, and so the symbol for the lunar was the horns of the bull, or the horns which the Vikings used. This is a symbol for the lunar symbol, which you'll find everywhere in different religions. These are the horns that Moses wore. Here in Israel, you'll see carvings of the arms raised to raise and to praise the moon. And Egyptian paintings show the moon. The Blessed Mother in Christianity stands on the moon. You'll see the moon everywhere in the ancient world of religion, which was showing us that the moon was very important, even at the time of Moses in Egypt. Moon worship was very prominent. And of course today, the Islamic world still uses the moon also. And in the Western world, the moon is still used as a symbol. We're talking about a moon cult many thousands of years ago in Egypt, of which Moses was the leader of the Hebrew people, which were worshipers of the moon at that time. If you go on the web and just type in moon god Sin, It will have all kinds of information showing you about how the moon was a very important part of worship in the ancient world. And they will also tell you that Moses was a leader of a lunar cult. There's a lot of information about the moon cult and the moon god, Yahweh or Allah. Here is a classic example in the ancient world of the moon god Sin. The god himself, his name was called Sin. And in the ancient world, Ai was a mountain in the times of ancient Egypt. Ai was a mountain, and so we have this moon god Sin on in the mountain, Ai, and put it together and becomes Sinai. So Mount Sinai is actually, the moon god Sin in the mountain of Sinai. Well, Mount Sinai today is felt to be the center for and the really foundation for the Jewish religion as it began to spread throughout the Middle East. Mount Sinai was where God met with Moses. God met with his people at Mount Sinai. But Mount Sinai is actually Sin Ai. Now it's interesting that today in most of the Western world, the word synagogue is spelled S-Y-N-A. But in Israel, it's S-I-N-A, because Israel realizes that the original word was S-I-N, not S-Y-N, and because of the moon god Sin. Synagogue basically means temple of the moon, because Sin was the moon god. I think it's important to realize that there's a difference in the way it's spelled, one way in Israel and a different way in the rest of the world. Here is just one of many reference works. This is by Andrew Kay from the Southern Methodist University. His article is Traces of the Worship of the Moon God Sin Among the Early Israelites. The Jewish tradition talks about the combination of the heavenly moon as a part of the most important part of the Jewish worship at that time. There are many symbols and emblems and paintings showing Moses in relation to the moon. And so here is pictures of a priest lighting a fire to signal a new moon. Here you will see an illustration of the Israelites and their worship of the moon, the prayer to the new moon. And below you will see sanctification of the new moon. This is from Amsterdam as far back as 1723, showing the importance still in the worship of Israel for the new moon, or for the moon. Above you will see the new moon etching from a book back in 1748, showing the Jews celebrating the new moon. Today, the new moon is still very important around the world to many cultures. And here we have a picture of Egypt and the Sinai. And down toward the bottom of the Sinai, there was a huge mountain range. And so here we see a better picture where Mount Sinai is referred to in the area of the wilderness of Sin. And Sin, of course, is the moon god. Sin is originally the moon god of the Arabic world. Allah and Sin and Moses with Yahweh, it all had to do with the worship of the moon god Sin. For some reason, the ancient Arabic world placed a very high respect on the moon. It's probably based on some phenomena that the new moon caused, because the Arabic world and the ancient world in general realized that the moon has a huge effect on our bodies. It has an effect on our food supply, and it pulls the oceans of the world. And so the moon was very important to the ancient world. I mean, that is a whole study in itself, why the ancient Arabic world had such a reverence for the moon. They always used the moon to keep the track of days, because their days started at sundown, at 6 o'clock. Because why? Because that's when the moon comes out. Even Islam today has a symbol of Saturn that is dominantly important to Islam, and it was a black square or a black cube. And the black cube represents the planet Saturn. Well, that's what Mecca is in Saudi Arabia, is a black cube, a black square. All over the world, large black cubes and architecture and churches and monasteries, huge black square cubes, just like Mecca. In the movie 2001, Space Odyssey, in the book, the original book on that gave birth to the movie, in the book it was the astronauts were going to the planet Saturn to find this black cube. There again is the black cube in the planet Saturn. Anyone who studies the dark arts, the dark sciences, or the world of the occult knows that Saturn is very important to the dark side of this world in relation to religion and occultism. Saturn is the inhibitor. It'll set you back and teach you a lesson. Saturn represented government, military, the police department, governmental agencies. The Saturnalia was the celebration in Rome for the planet Saturn. And it happened like 13 days before the 25th. So it was like 12 days before what we call today Christmas. But it was the 12 days before, and it was called Saturnalia because Saturn was in Rome considered to be the god of chaos. That was another thing he was known for. What the Romans did with worshiping Saturn, they actually had 12 days of chaos in which the kings would bow to slaves and prisoners were let loose and they would be in charge of their masters who put them in prison. There was alcohol and sex and drugs and whatever you wanted. In the Roman Empire, you're free to do whatever it is you want to do. And so if you are a slave, when Saturnalia comes, you can go to the house of your master and bring him out and make him bow down and kiss your feet. So the idea was it was a chaotic time in which all law was just thrown away. And now it was up to anybody, whatever it is you want, go out and get it and take it. Today we call it Christmas. In the Roman Empire, the Saturnalia. And then there was a Brumalia, which was based on the worship of Saturn too. A very important NASA scientist named Norman Berglund has written a book called The Ring Makers of Saturn. And in that book, Norman Berglund, the scientist, shows actual pictures taken of the rings of Saturn, and one in particular has some sort of a vehicle, space vehicle, that is creating another ring. And it's not quite finished. So there's a ring on this side, and there is some kind of a space vehicle creating the ring, and it's almost ready to connect the ring, but it's not quite. And so we got some beautiful pictures. And it's going to ultimately connect it together, and that'll be a new ring in Saturn. So we know that the rings are artificial. Somebody's made them. I was speaking up in a conference in San Francisco a few years ago. He came over to me, and I wasn't expecting that. And he said, "Jordan, I've come here to meet you. I want to talk with you in private." And so we went back into the back of the restaurant and sat there, and he says, "I'm here to tell you something. I've come here, after I talk to you, I'm going home." And he said, "But you've been talking about the planet Saturn. I want to show you some things about Saturn you don't know." And so he pulls out some pictures. He had some pictures and NASA pictures. So he said, "But what we do know is that it's inhabited." My question was, could the rings be like a dish for communication in deep space? Because we have television dishes, the big dishes. Maybe the rings could be some kind of a communication device that can send out or receive from extreme distances, hundreds of light years away, with this dish set up. And he said, well, that's interesting. I don't know, that much about that idea. Saturn is a very important planet that balances out the positions of other stars. Jupiter and Saturn dominate our solar system. They're so large. Saturn is important in not only its physical qualities of being able to exert energy fields and sounds, but it also goes back into ancient history, which makes it really interesting. How did the ancient peoples know so much about the planet Saturn and also associate Saturn, as they did, with dark mystical forces? Saturn is probably the dominant figure in dark religions today, in the occult world, metaphysics. Saturn plays a prominent part in all magical systems. As a matter of fact, in Germany today, there is a very powerful secret society called the Brotherhood of Saturn. The books written about them say they are probably the most important secret society on the face of the earth. They are connected behind the scenes to all kinds of powerful organizations, governments, secret societies. I think the darkness associated with the planet Saturn and the occult religions of the world has to do with some actual, in fact, influence that Saturn has on the human race that the Jewish people realized that we didn't realize. And they probably got the idea from other ancient cultures that also venerated the planet Saturn. I am convinced that the world we live in is being dominated by an extraterrestrial presence. And I think that extraterrestrial presence is the one who is feeding us our ideas about theology, religion, the occult world, governmental systems, churches, and somehow the older teachers were knowledgeable about planet Saturn. But David Icke has been talking about this too for a long time, that Saturn is a very important planet to the occult world. And it is, because if you do any research into occultism, secret societies, Freemasonry, you will find that Saturn dominates the whole subject.